Many of us have seen the shocking images a few months ago of Afghans desperately clinging to U.S. military planes evacuating from Kabul, Afghanistan's capital. Those images represented the chaotic and what many would call disastrous end to the 20-year war in Afghanistan. As the Taliban once again consolidates its power in the country, it is now trying to gain legitimacy and international recognition. One of their first steps was to ask to speak to world leaders at the United Nations. Why does speaking at the UN matter for the Taliban? What is next for Afghanistan and for the balance of power in the Middle East? Why should Americans pay attention to what happens in the region and in the United Nations more generally? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Bias, the Open-Minded Perspective podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Craig Albert, Associate Professor of Political Science at Augusta University. Today, we are talking to Nadia Jilani-Hyler, a Senior Lecturer in Political Science at Augusta University. Professor Nadia teaches a variety of classes, including Introduction to American Government, U.S. Foreign Policy, Middle East Security Studies, and my favorite, the Model United Nations, which we'll get into. She also conducts research on economic sanctions, cyber aggression, terrorism, and government responses to COVID-19. Professor Nadia is an expert in U.S. foreign policy, the UN, and the Middle East and Northern Africa. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into this. So first of all, what is your take on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan? Was the Taliban takeover of the country inevitable?
At this point, the Taliban takeover was probably inevitable. Yeah, that's my take on it. I think that especially after the Doha Agreement between the United States and the Taliban, kind of leaving out the Afghan government itself, really set the stage for that Taliban takeover. It kind of sent the message to everyone else within the government, within the military forces, that this is between the U.S. and the Taliban now, and whatever happens to the government happens. So it kind of sent the message that we didn't necessarily have a ton of faith in the Afghan government and military to begin with.
Has the U.S. failed in Afghanistan? Have we failed our Afghan allies whose lives are at risk under the new Taliban regime?
I think that given the history of invasion in Afghanistan forever, the United States was kind of doomed to fail from the beginning. Yeah. And if we look at, British invasion of Afghanistan failed, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan failed. The United States tried to come at it from a slightly different angle where, we tried to work with the locals on the ground. We tried to set up a government that was internationally recognized, but international invasion of Afghanistan is largely doomed to fail for a variety of reasons. And so I think that over 20 years, Afghanistan benefited in some ways from the United States invasion, but there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who lost lives, were casualties of that war, who would say otherwise.
I mean, nobody's done well in Afghanistan. I mean, to my knowledge, the only kind of successful campaign against Afghanistan was Alexander the Great, and he was successful, but as soon as, of course, he died, the Greeks and Macedons lost power in Afghanistan. So nobody has been able to come in and hold the front, so to say, with Afghanistan. I think it's one of those places that they call the graveyard of empires, right?
Yes, yeah.
So bringing this into the context of the UN, did the UN system fail in Afghanistan? Because I think I can say everybody knew somebody was going into Afghanistan. So there wasn't like a unjust part of the Afghan war for getting rid of terrorism after 9/11. So Why wasn't it a UN mission versus U.S.? And could they have done better?
So I think largely it wasn't a UN mission because the UN wanted no part of it. No part of the conflict, right, of fighting. They've learned over the years that they're not very good at that. Somalia, Bosnia, you've had peacekeepers on the ground where bad stuff happened, and it really hurt their reputation. There was a big reputational cost for that. And so knowing that this was going to happen anyway, knowing that the United States was well equipped to go in and with a quote-unquote coalition of the willing, with NATO forces as well, there were more than enough people, military forces, to fight this war. And so the United Nations did what it did much better, which is negotiation, bringing people to the table, figuring out the details of an interim government, and of course, humanitarian aid.
So explain the UN's like peacekeeping idea. Well, what's its general point? Why does the UN even exist? Let's say that, because in my mind, it's like they didn't want to part in Afghanistan. Well, isn't this kind of what they should be doing?
Yeah. I mean, when we think of the United Nations and how it was created and what it was created out of, it was the end of World War II and kind of trying to take up where the League of Nations fell apart before that. And the ultimate goal was a collective security pact that members would come to each other's aid if they were attacked. But the way that the system ended up getting set up was such that the Security Council, which is kind of the only body that really has the authority to send in fighting forces, send in peacekeeping troops, sanction countries, they really have kind of the power to engage other countries in ways that challenge maybe their sovereignty a little bit. And that Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members. The P5 is what they're referred to as: the United States, China, Russia, France, and Great Britain. And those are all the big, powerful countries in the world, and they don't like to impose sanctions or send peacekeeping troops or get involved if it harms their national interest. So all of those P5 countries have a veto in the Security Council. And so that ends up kind of stymieing the opportunity for the United Nations to really take a lead on international conflict.
So Russia and China would have never allowed the UN to go into Afghanistan anyways, even if the UN was capable of that type of peace operation.
Yeah, you probably would have seen some opposition, some vetoes to a UN peacekeeping operation there.
If the Taliban were allowed to speak at the United Nations General Assembly, what would that mean? Would that give the Taliban legitimacy? Help me understand this.
Right. They do have control, and other countries that also have questionably ethical policies are members of the United Nations, right? Saudi Arabia is a member of the United Nations, longtime member. Other countries that have similar policies against their citizens are also human rights abusers, are members, right? They have that legitimacy. But yes, to answer your first question, being recognized by the United Nations, being invited to speak, grants the Taliban the legitimacy of the international community. And at this time, they're very hesitant to do that. It's, again, kind of inevitable that it'll probably happen. But at this moment, the United Nations has some leverage over convincing the Taliban to maybe change their policies, lighten up some of their policies, to influence what happens on the ground in Afghanistan. So if you want to be a legitimate member of our community, you should probably impose these changes to your policies, and then perhaps we'll allow you into our club.
Is this a kinder, gentler Taliban, or is this a Taliban who's savvier than they were in 96 to 01 at understanding the media and messaging, and they definitely understand social media? I mean, just like Al-Qaeda, just like ISIS.
I think a lot of it is that they're better at at the messaging, but they've also become better governors in general, right? I mean, if we think about Afghanistan before the 2001 invasion, there was no economy. The policies were really strict, but there wasn't a lot coming out of. There wasn't a lot of production coming out of Afghanistan, and part of that was that the Taliban are religious scholars. They're not economists, right? They don't have a lot of the training in other areas of education that they really needed, and they were only putting their own people in these positions, and they may not have really been qualified for that. And so that might be something that they've learned. We've seen that they're kind of trying to tamp down on the educated people leaving the country, partly because they know that they need them. And yes, they may be rounding some of them up. Some might be abused, tortured, what have you, killed. But others might be convinced to come into the fold and help the government.
And they have put people that are non-Taliban, like Hassani, they appointed him to a minister position, and there's been some fighting about that. But they do seem to be reaching out. And I wonder if the Taliban learned from ISIS. And again, this is a sensitive subject. We are not validating the Taliban as rulers or ISIS, but it's interesting to draw the understanding that the Islamic State, learning from Hamas, understood social services, understood like a social security net. So I wonder if the Taliban has learned from that, and therefore they appear to be better governors because of their experience. And they've been around for a long time now, like trying to learn how to govern and fight.
I remember, I can't remember what year it was, but the Taliban was out of power in Afghanistan. And of course, you've got Pakistani and Afghani Taliban as well. And there was a big earthquake in Pakistan, and one of the first organizations that was on the ground helping was the Taliban.
Wow.
Right, which is kind of surprising to think about, this kind of militia fighting force being kind of a social security force. But yes, Hezbollah, Hamas, lots of these organizations have social wings of their organization that, you can belong to Hezbollah and not ever pick up a weapon. You're helping with healthcare in your community, or, providing food to the indigent in your community. And, there's a smart reason for this, because you can recruit people to your cause much easier if you're providing this. And in countries where the government isn't doing that for people, then they can turn to these organizations, which gives them legitimacy in their eyes, gives them power, gives them a recruiting tool. It really is a smart way to grow your organization and keep it alive.
So from a foreign policy perspective, now being a little parochial, just as U.S. citizens, why should Americans pay attention to Afghanistan and the Middle East?
Well, terrorism largely can affect us. We saw that with 9/11. And that's something that our foreign policy experts have to keep an eye on and keep. We need to know what the chatter is. We need to know what the plans are so that we can stop them before we have another attack on our soil. Unfortunately, we are the big kid on the block who is a major target for a lot of these terrorist organizations.
Is there something that the U.S. can do, like for conditions on the ground to prevent terrorism? And is there some kind of cultural understanding or some type of, is there a way besides fundamentally altering the United States' foreign policy or national security strategy that could help alleviate potential threats from terrorist organizations?
I can't think of any, to be honest with you.
If you come up with an answer, that's probably a Nobel Peace Prize.
Right, yeah. So, yes, messaging can help, right? So trying to better understand the Middle East, better understand Islam, better understand the cultural differences between these countries and the West or the United States. But these groups also need a bad guy. They need somebody to point to as the bad guy so that nobody's looking at them, right? Al-Qaeda's killed many, many more Muslims in the world than they've killed Americans, right? And so, if people take enough time to think about it, they might not come up smelling like roses. And having the big bad enemy is something that these organizations really need. Sometimes it might be the governments under which they exist themselves. So Middle Eastern countries themselves, which are very autocratic, tend to be very autocratic. I don't want to lump everyone together.
What's that mean?
They, have very strict governments, authoritarian governments. They don't provide a whole lot of human rights. And one of the other things that we see in these countries is that the governments also tend to dabble in the private sector as well. So they give their friends the contracts, the cushy government contracts, and they're all making money off of the business of government. and everybody else in the country is kind of left to their own devices. So that's a system where there's a lot of resentment against the government. And it's also not very Islamic, right? There's a whole like social justice aspect of Islam that is not really being carried out in these Muslim majority countries, or most of these Muslim majority countries. And so that's another thing that organizations, by giving this sort of social angle, can tap into and say, look, we're doing the real business and work of the true faith. And so that is another way to kind of legitimize their actions when they aren't in line with Islam. So, murdering civilians is not
Islamic.
Right. Yeah, it's not something that the Prophet taught to do. So, they're able to kind of say, don't look at what we're doing here, but look at what we're doing here. And your government's not doing it, so we're going to fight against the government. So it could be more of an insurgency type of thing within the country, but more so it helps to have the big bad United States, I think, as the enemy number one of many of these groups. And I should also mention that one of the reasons that the United States is the ultimate bad guy is because we get a lot of the blame for the authoritarian governments that exist in these countries as well, right? Americans forget or never learn about how we've propped up many of these authoritarian governments in the past, and continue to in some ways as well, or continue to legitimize them in various ways. And so, that's another reason that there's this resentment towards the United States, because, people look at their lives, the way that their government is holding them back, so to speak. And why is that? Well, because the United States, kept dictators in power, helped shield them from international shame or what have you.
So the U.S. thinks that propping up these dictators creates stability in those governments, which is in the national interest of the U.S.
Yes.
But those regimes tend to bear down on human rights and not create decent or dignified living conditions. And so groups believe that then the U.S. is responsible for the way they are treated in those countries. So it's not like the U.S. wants to just proffer these dictators. It's that it's in their national interest to have stable orders in these regimes, even if they have to balance or mitigate human rights against those regimes.
Exactly.
And this was, again, I'm not legitimizing this, so I expect to get some angry emails, but this was bin Laden's 96 fatwa against the United States, was that you are propping up these governments. And that's why he kind of started his campaign against the U.S. Why should U.S. citizens, why should the listeners, the viewers care about the UN?
The United Nations partly exists because of the United States, right? So after World War II, we ended up bringing these 51 countries together to sign the UN Charter and create this organization. And we have a big stake in what happens at the United Nations. So again, as one of the P5, as one of the founding members, as one of the wealthiest and most powerful members in the organization, we have a lot of power to lead in what direction the organization decides to take. And so, you remove yourself from the organization, it can still exist without you. This was something that Russia learned when they stormed off and left the P5, right? And the United States ended up going into Korea with UN backing, because Russia wasn't there to veto it, right? So you want to have a seat at the table so that decisions don't get made that harm you as a country. And we provide 22% of the resources to the UN, far more than in any of the other countries. And so again, that gives us some backing, some power. We have some authority to decide where that gets spent and how it gets spent. And we can pull out of organizations, special agencies that we might not agree with at any particular time as well. And so in doing so, we have that seat at the table. We have an ability to guide the policies and procedures of the organization itself. And it does a lot of good in terms of sort of the human security angle, right? So we mentioned that they're terrible at conflict, right? And conflict resolution in terms of negotiation, they're very good at, but not in terms of boots on the ground,
Right.
taking care of things. But in an area that they're exceptional at is aid, development, helping or groups, populations that are suffering, whether that's refugee populations, populations that are experiencing famine, right? These agencies of the United Nations do an amazing job of that. And so if there's an aid organization that's helping refugees, let's say, where they are, that's fewer refugees that are trying to come to the United States to escape their circumstances, right? So if you're an American citizen, then that might be in your interest. So it's complicated because there are many different orders of or levels of importance, and it's not necessarily a direct line from the United States in the UN and how it benefits our citizens. But if you think about all of the different ways and all of the different things that the United Nations does as a whole, it benefits the U.S. in a variety of ways.
So for citizens that don't like the UN or say, oh, the U.S. just wastes money there or something like that, it's actually a pretty inexpensive way for the United States to exert its global leadership. Mm-hmm. I mean, because it's 22% of the UN budget comes from the U.S., but that's not a ton of money from the U.S. Actually, really, it's less than 2 or 3% of our foreign aid. Period. Mm-hmm. Even though it goes to 22% of the UN, it doesn't really cost the United States that much. And the benefits, the idea is that if the UN handles these issues of low or soft politics properly, that they won't turn into big issues or war. So if you get in on the ground and handle famine or international refugee and migration services before something gets cataclysmically out of order, then they won't have conflict. And that obviously benefits the U.S. and the world order generally.
Right.
Let's get into specific here. This is what I really want to talk about into teaching the United Nations systems. I didn't want to just start with this because I wanted to make sure the audience understood, why the UN is around and, how it helps with things in Afghanistan or could help or ought to help or how it fails. Mm-hmm. So how do you teach the UN to university students?
It's one of my favorite subjects to teach. And part of that is because it's one where you can be really hands-on. Model UN has existed for a very long time. And so there are lots of different lessons that you can use to teach students how all of this fits together and how everything works and how the United Nations is trying to help solve global problems. And that's one of the things that the UN is actually really good at, right? The issues that one country can't solve single-handedly. Right. The United States can solve or try to solve lots of conflicts around the world or other bilateral issues that we've worked on, but we individually can't solve climate change, right? We individually
crosses boundaries.
Exactly, can't solve COVID, right? So all of these issues that are global in reach that affect just about everyone, the United Nations serves as a platform where everybody can kind of come together, learn best practices, share information, and really try to move forward to solve those problems. So that's one thing that I try to drive home very quickly with the students is how useful the United Nations can be in a variety of areas. And we get to be really hands-on playing these simulation games of the United Nations.
So explain the Model UN, because I'm sure most of the audience has no idea what this is. So you teach the UN through what's a simulation, a game called the Model United Nations. So just break that down for us.
So I kind of refer to it as United Nations LARPing. LARPing stands for live action role play. So we get assigned a country from the National Model United Nations Conference. This year we're going to be Vietnam, which is very exciting.
I was so stoked to hear that.
And then we learn all about our country, and we learn about the United Nations system as well, right? What does the Security Council do? What does the General Assembly do? What are all of these different specialized agencies and committees that exist, and how do they work on global issues, as well as learning about those global issues themselves too. And so as we're learning these things, we're coming up with our own solutions from our country's perspective, which is another great thing about Model UN, is that you get to learn about these global issues, not just from the American perspective. So you really have to put yourself in the mindset of another country, maybe a poorer country. Many countries in the world don't contribute 22% of the budget to the UN, but they use up a lot of that budget because the UN has a lot of special agencies on the ground trying to help in these countries. And so if you're Zimbabwe, for example, there are going to be a lot of organizations on the ground that are helping you. And again, that gives you a different perspective of what the UN can do. When you're seeing the benefit of, babies getting vaccinated and food programs coming and helping families, and the High Commission for Refugees providing tents for refugee families, you can really see the benefit of what's happening.
So so they learn the UN system, they learn about the country that they're representing. Mm-hmm. What type of skills, how does this help them with jobs in the future, for instance? Because I know they learn, it's not just academic a knowledge, which of course is important in the university setting, but they actually learn skills as well that are helping with anything that they do in their career. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work on a variety of skills that can translate into really any career that you move into moving on. So we work on policy papers, so professional writing. We write the same paper over and over and over again to kind of get it right, based on the requirements that the National Model United Nations Conference sets for us. So it's a question of answering the question, right? Which is something that some of our students struggle with. They'd rather answer the question that they want to answer rather than the question that they've been given.
Yeah, right? That's all students' issues, right?
meeting all of the requirements, all of the things that the National Model United Nations is asking for.
So you teach policy writing, technical writing skills, which translates into business, science, mathematics, any of those hard sciences use technical writing.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
Awesome.
And they're having to use the jargon and all of the terminology. So they're learning all of this and how to incorporate it into a paper in a way that doesn't take away from the substance of the paper. And then they practice public speaking.
The great horror for most people.
Yes, we give lots of speeches in class. We practice that public speaking because, again, when they go to the conference, they're going to have to speak in front of anywhere from 20 to 200 people.
Wow.
And we want them to be comfortable with that. We want them to be confident in that.
And they're suited up, right? So
Yes. We come to class prepared, feeling our power suits.
And so they have to learn how to eat, work, give a speech in suits, which most people just aren't used to.
Yes, especially
so that's a real practical
students.
Thing that they learn is just how to be comfortable in a suit.
Yes,
because it's not comfortable to wear a suit. That's awesome. What else? What do you do when because I know you go to New York, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, Nadia is the director of the Model United Nations program here, and also the director of the Junior Model United Nations. So she allows the community to participate in this by having middle schools come to campus and do a smaller version of the Model United Nations that's held in New York every year. So when you go to New York with the college group, what do you do? Is it just 18 hours a day at the conference and then you come home, or what else?
No, of course, that would be a really hard sell. We definitely also do some sightseeing. So, I usually give a little bit of a chance for the students in the class to pick what they'd rather do. But we almost always go to the Empire State Building. We've done, which you hate.
Yes. I laugh, folks, and Nadia knows because I'm terrified of heights, and she has seen me cry in the Empire State Building as well as hundreds of students.
Yes, they love that too.
Yes.
You didn't get to come last time, but we also have taken a cruise around the harbor, New York Harbor. So a boat tour at sunset. So you get to watch the lights come up, and it's really cool, and learn a little bit about the layout of the city and stuff like that too. We definitely go eat a lot, and we try to eat at least one culturally relevant restaurant to the country that we've been assigned. But also, we got to hit up Little Italy and get some good Italian
Danico's.
food. Yeah.
Shout out there. Maybe they'll sponsor the podcast. So something really cool that I've always enjoyed, and it doesn't always happen, but the students get the opportunity to meet with actual ambassadors, actual delegates. Can you talk about that in a couple minutes?
Yeah, so last time we went, we were Iceland. Last time we physically got to go to New York, we represented Iceland, and we got to go to the Icelandic mission to the UN and meet with one of their delegates, ask them questions about the issues, Iceland's stance on the issues that our students would later be discussing in committee. So it was a really great experience to kind of pick the brain of the person that you're trying to represent at the conference. And, they usually treat you to some coffee and pastries, sometimes culturally relevant pastries and stuff, too. You had a cool experience with the Iran mission, right?
Oh, yeah. So earlier on, full disclosure, I was the director of the Model UN for a while here at Augusta University. And, yeah, we got to meet the Iranian delegation, which was just, it was pretty amazing because that's something most folks don't get to do. And you're on sovereign territory when you go into these places. So we had to get through their security, and we were inside Iran in the United States. It was really bizarre. And, they had their assistants walking around, checking up on what we were writing as we were taking notes, and shooing off questions that were probably uncomfortable for them to answer because it could have put the Iranians in calling their bluff kind of about human rights or things like that. And it was just really, even for a professor, a scholar, it was really cool for me to be there and just witness a different type of governing structure in person. And the students were just really in awe too. I mean, there was always this guy just circling around us, and it was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. And they were like, "He's just our assistant." And I was like, "I bet he's your assistant." Like, we're not taking any bad notes. Like, thank you for having us. I mean, they were generous in letting us come there, and it was awesome. But it was just a different side of that, especially if you compare it to the Icelandic mission. It's just laid back and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And the Iranians provided tea. They provided tons of cultural pastries for us. I mean, they went all out with what they set up, and it was just awesome. So they were very gracious, but you could also feel the tension. Like, they knew they were talking to American students, and they knew that we knew we were talking to Iranians, and that dynamic was certainly clear, especially to all the students. Yeah. This is awesome. Can you give one takeaway to the audience about Afghanistan or security or the UN or anything that could be useful or help students decide what they want to do or help parents decide? Or
well, one takeaway about Model UN is that more consistently than anything else, our students say that they come out of it with confidence. So that's just the coolest, most rewarding thing as a professor, to be told that, I came into this class and I really wasn't sure about what was going on, or I really wasn't comfortable talking in front of people, but I come out of it feeling more confident in who I am as a scholar, as a student, as somebody that's going to be going into the job market soon. And so that's a really cool takeaway about just Model UN in general, I think.
And that's awesome. And as professors, it's always cool to be able to bond with students. And I think the Model UN program, more than any other course or program I'm involved in, teaches us to love our students and the students to love us in a professional academic way. And you just really, bond with them and create a common identity. And you become munners, as we say, forever, right? Like, once a munner, always a munner.
Definitely.
This is awesome. We're gonna, folks, if you want to help the Model United Nation program here at Augusta University, will provide some links to donate to the program, to the foundation account for Augusta University, to help these students. There's scholarship opportunities if you want to help the underrepresented or underprivileged students pay for the trip. It does cost money, so we always do what we can to try to raise money for them as well. So we'll put all these links in the show notes when it comes out, and on the Instagram for it. Thank you so much, Professor Nadia, for being here. It's awesome to talk to you on the podcast and to let everybody hear why you're so awesome.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
Make sure to follow us on social media. Like us, subscribe, share, comment, email. We are at beyond_bias_podcast on the gram. Our YouTube channel is Beyond Bias Podcast Channel. Feel free to email us at, yep, you guessed it, beyondbiaspodcast@gmail.com. And of course, follow me, your host, on all the typical platforms. I am at Dr. Craig D. Albert. Professor Nadia, is there a way for listeners to follow or keep up with you and or the UN program on social media?
I am on Facebook. The Model UN is on Facebook and Twitter at Augusta Model UN.
At Augusta Model UN and Augusta University Model UN on Facebook. And we will post those links so you can donate, follow, keep up, see some pictures of what they'll do this year in New York as they represent the delegation from Vietnam. And as always, we end with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, the eminent social and political philosopher. Quote, "There are two things which a democratic people will always find very difficult: to begin a war and to end it." End quote. Be nice to someone today and know that you are loved.